and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your first couple words of the intro host, Madelyn.
I'm your next few words of the intro host, Emma.
Hey, what's that supposed to mean? Was that an insult?
Yes!
Was that a dig?
Yes, it was.
That's it! This podcast is canceled!
Oh no.
Did you like that, listeners?
Madelyn came in just before we started recording. Madelyn was like, I don't have a funny joke. And you know what? She was right.
Okay, now I am gonna cancel you for real.
Yeah, so in case you are, you've taken a break, you haven't listened to the last few episodes, or you're new here, we're on our side quest rotation that we introduced a few months ago, and it is my turn to pick the topic, which I sort of gave a preview for on last week's episode.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The fact, when you said we started this format a couple of months ago, I felt myself, shrivel up and get old. Because you're right, it has been a couple months, but, yikes. Anyway,
it's
go on.
been specifically, 14 weeks, I think, because this is our third go-round.
Neat.
Something like that.
I feel good about myself and how old I am.
Yes.
Go ahead and explain the episode while I ponder the grave.
On this episode, in tradition of the fact that I always pick a topic that's way too big for our hour-long format, whereas Madelyn always picks something that's just the right size, but it's fine. We're talking about outrage culture, sort of, in games. Stuff like internet backlash. Why does it happen? Where does it come from? Why do fans get so riled up when things that they like do things that they don't like? Stuff like that, in terms of how social media is influencing how we interact with media, and then specifically games as a quote-unquote new media, how that plays in to everything. So I have a couple of examples that were getting me thinking about it, and one of them's obvious, so I'll leave that one for last, because if you're into games and have been on Twitter at all in the last year...
Even if you're aware of what a video game is.
Yeah, you've probably heard of it. But there's a few more examples that I think will elucidate what we're going to be talking about from both in and out of games. So first of all, from way, way back, some of you may remember Puddlegate from Spider-Man, in which there was a new trailer released for Spider-Man that looked great, but some people online got very fixated about the size of a puddle because they had seen it in a previous trailer and it was now smaller and less quote-unquote good-looking than it had been previously. And so there was this big backlash about Spider-Man going through a graphical downgrade or whatever, basically all based on the size of this puddle. And people got very, very mad. Similarly, later, when they didn't have, the Spider-Man 2 costume for a while from the Sam Raimi trilogy, people were very, very mad about that for a while. And were sort of harassing developers at Insomniac about putting it in, which they then announced it was put in, which probably had nothing to do with the internet backlash. It was probably already planned from the get-go. They hadn't announced it yet because it wasn't done. So why do we get upset about that? And then there's a few
Similarly, important third example. Similarly, there was a big backlash in my immediate area when we booted up the game and my specific apartment building wasn't in the game. They haven't fixed it yet, but I'm still waiting for a patch.
One day, Madelyn, maybe. On the PS5 version. And then a couple of things outside of games, just as examples. I've been watching an anime called Vinland Saga since this summer. And on a recent episode, there was literally, it's based on a manga that people love, which is always a bad sign in these cases. And there's one adaptation of literally one panel from the manga that quote unquote wasn't as good. So lots of fans, but let's say a lot of Western fans, got on Twitter and specifically harassed the director of the show until he felt like he needed to apologize for that one panel of what is otherwise a hugely ambitious production that's mostly satisfactory on sort of an animation scale.
I looked at those side-by-side comparisons and I was kind of confused. The panels in the manga seem to be pretty heavily stylized.
Yeah,
in a way
they
that
are.
I don't think, unless the whole aesthetic of this anime is in that vibe, don't really feel like would translate.
The art style of the manga, in my opinion, is something that just would not go into animation well at all. So, of course, in making a animated version, you have to make some compromises on what it looks like and character designs and all this sort of other stuff in order to make it move good. And even then, these are insanely detailed designs that are very hard to move around convincingly. And so the fact that fans just went on Twitter and social media, and this director has a Twitter and social media, and went up to just this one guy and was like, "This sucks," until he felt like he needed to apologize, is just crazy to me. And that's something that can tie into, because it's interesting how the more personal it is, people who make things put their actual face on Twitter now as opposed to just behind a company or whatever, which means that they're more accessible, which is cool until, people go to harass you about anything. And then finally, for a while I've been I sort of half follow this show called Ruby, which is an animated show from Rooster Teeth.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, Ruby.
I've just been thinking in my head all the time, RWBY, RWBY.
And I wrote an essay on this my last semester of college about sort of the very toxic nature of its fandom. And Ruby is you could do a whole talk on this topic because there's lots of complications in that the original creator passed away pretty early into the show's run. And there are a lot of people who are upset with Rooster Teeth's decision to keep making it, and lots of people who think that they're straying from his vision, and lots of people who like to take this dead man's name and attribute opinions to it about the show, and lots of generally disgusting stuff that the fandom does. But what was fascinating to me is that all these people who really abjectly hate it, despise this show, are still watching it. Just so that basically they can despise it publicly. Right? It's basically there's a section of the viewer base that is just watching you in order to enact sort of the public performance of disliking it. And so I was very interested in what would the psychology be behind that? Why do we not just hate watch things I might hate watch The Bachelor, but keep up with things that just make us miserable, basically. So those are a lot of examples in order to sort of illustrate what I wanted to talk about, I guess.
You skipped the big example, Emma.
Oh, right. The big example is Dexit, and not even just exclusively Dexit, but the general situation surrounding Pokemon Sword and Shield on social media. In terms of people complaining about the graphics or the animations or the big thing is that not every Pokemon in existence is in the game anymore. Partially because Game Freak said that, well, this is their first console game for one thing. And in going to the Switch, they had to remake a lot of animations from scratch in order to put them into the game.
Also, there are a lot of kind of sometimes deliberate misunderstandings of the quotes that have really driven the Game Freak lied hashtags.
Right.
The actual Famitsu interview that many of these are drawn from oh, I can't remember who it is who's actually interviewed, but someone at Game Freak, he does say all these things of they needed to redo some of the animations and like they needed to preserve space and whatever. But every time he offers the caveat of, but really it's just because we want to focus on new features and be able to do new things.
Yeah.
So even the quotes that have been kind of bandied around are really being interpreted pretty disingenuously.
Yeah. But that's sort of the proliferation of social media, right? If you see something somewhere, a lot of people will just take that as absolute fact, right? Like some person that you follow and get opinions from says, oh, this guy said this, and suddenly you're like, oh, that guy said this, and you don't bother to go actually confirm the source for yourself because you have some trust in this internet profile, basically.
I really hate reading about Dexit, but I have a really hard time looking away.
Right.
I just keep scrolling, hoping that I'll find a reasonable take somewhere. Or maybe I can't even like quite put my finger on like why I keep clicking on the comments on Pokemon articles.
Right.
Like I just want somebody to have realized that this was dumb.
I mean, on Friday, when I was doing the majority of the research I was doing for this, I was also just on Twitter. And Tim Rogers posted a video for Kotaku that then almost immediately he replied to a tweet like, well, it's been up for an hour and I've already gotten like 18 incredibly hateful comments. And the thread like continues into like every comment I get more convinced that one of them will kill me someday, basically, which is like a joke until it's not a joke, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that it's not, there's so much rage that's directed not even just at the developer, but at people who like the game, like how dare they like this piece of trash, basically, when it's like, there's a difference between legitimate criticism and just being outraged. I feel like it's important to note. Like, you can wish the new Pokemon game was a little bit more than it was, right? Like, that's perfectly reasonable. And you can even express what you wish that Pokemon game was in a public forum. But I think it becomes an issue when you are attacking people simply for disagreeing with you, or attacking personally the people who made that game.
Yeah, and I do feel like it's a little, I don't know, everyone, like, even among the comments where I see where people are just expressing reasonable disagreement, it's like, okay, like, this one comment is reasonable, but I have a strong feeling that you've gone down every tweet in this hashtag and posted the same sort of reasonable comment. And, like, is it still a sort of reasonable comment if you felt the need to say it to 100 different strangers?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that in practice before, of like, I'll be looking at a hashtag for some reason and I'll see the same person posting the same thing over and over again, or I'll be watching something on YouTube about something and I'll see the same person on a ton of videos like commenting the exact same, like you said, sort of reasonable take about something. But it does show a level of obsessiveness if you want to go out of your way to tell everybody that, right?
Yeah. Like, it's fine that you think the tree textures are bad. They are pretty bad. But it starts to get a little bit weird when you want to kind of quiet yell that at everybody who's talking about the game.
Yeah. Something also that Dexit as sort of, and the stuff around us made me realize is that a lot of these people just have absolutely no conception of how game development works, right? Like, there was the whole meme of like, you can make a Pokemon in 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
But the original source for that was someone who literally seemed to believe that, right? That you could just make a Pokemon in 5 minutes and stick it in the game, which is like absolutely false. Like, even if you were talented enough to like make and model a Pokemon in 5 minutes. Like, you have to export that crap. And that does not take 5 minutes no matter what. So, and like people like throwing around like, you know, the words like textures and draw distance and shadows, like they actually know what that means, right?
Yeah.
It's like they've just picked, it's like when you're learning a foreign language and you know like 3 words so that you use that for everything, right? It's sort
Arigato
of
gozaimasu.
Yeah.
That's me.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of what was so bothersome to me about like the Vinland Saga situation, and going into anime is a whole other can of weeds, both for fandom and for like the exploitative nature of that industry. In terms of like people complaining about this one panel probably have absolutely no conception of like the hell that animators live in.
Yeah.
If they feel like they can just, like, again, like, it's one thing to have legitimate criticism and to talk about it from a removed level. You can say, oh, in Pokemon, I don't like the tree textures. It's another thing to, like, go and, like, tag the person, like, the artists who worked on Pokemon on Twitter and be like, you're crap and I hate you for these tree textures. You know?
It's so funny, too. I mean, I've really enjoyed all the people who are juxtaposing the Pokemon tree textures with just the god-awful fruit in Fire Emblem.
Yeah.
And it's like, nobody cared in Fire Emblem. What is it about the Pokemon fandom that makes them want to scream about kind of, you know, pixely trees?
I mean, to be fair, they're bigger. Right? The Pokemon fandom
sure.
Bigger than the Fire Emblem fandom.
Sure.
So, of course, you're going to have a more broad range of people who care about different things. But at the same time, conversely, like, these people are just a very vocal minority. Like, they had no effect on Sword and Shield's bottom line financially. It's the biggest Nintendo Switch launch to date. So when things happen like that with stuff like Pokemon and Star Wars, like, it's not at all hurting. In fact, you could argue that it might be helping the actual products that they're selling, right? Because it's driving engagement. No matter what, you can't get away from Pokemon or Star Wars or whatever, because everybody's talking about it, whether it's good or bad. And then maybe you see someone saying, "Oh man, like, oh, this Pokemon's so bad," or like, "The Last Jedi was so terrible," and you're like, "What? It was? I have to go see that for myself," right? In some cases. So it's not like I'm upset that things I like aren't making money. It's just when I see people like personally bullying people for stuff. You know, like Star Wars is a great example. Like, even back in the prequel days, like, the guy who played Jar Jar Binks was, like, harassed when he was just playing a role, right? Or recently, the woman who played, Kelly, I can't remember her name, Kelly, she played Rose in Last Jedi, was bullied off social media, basically.
Well, it just makes it impossible to have any kind of interesting conversation about these pieces of media, I feel like. At least until people, you know, have turned their attention to be mad about something else. Like, I think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about the Pokemon series and whether it's stagnated over the course of 20 plus years or whatever. Yeah. Or, like, what other interesting things could they have done with it, and what was successful and what was not successful, and, you know, how are they painting themselves into a... Like, there's interesting conversations to be had about this game that are much more nuanced than, it's bad. Yeah. My favorite... Let's, like, do a list. Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur. Yeah. Like, let's draw them crying. Like, there's so much more interesting conversation that I would love to have. why is the wireless connectivity stuck in 2005? Much more interesting to me than the tree textures. And yet, here we are. That said, another thought I wanted to bring up is I feel like in games specifically, so much of this kind of outrage centers around graphics. Like in Pokemon, with Puddlegate, with The Witcher 3, right? All these controversies seem to deal with graphics and specifically perceived graphical downgrades. I have a hard time feeling connected to this as someone who, one, just is not super interested in graphics in games in terms of, continued photorealism or whatever, but also two, just as someone who has never had the luxury to own hardware where even if I did really care about that I'd be able to.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of hard for me to care too much about graphics on my like launch year Nintendo Switch and my Mac and my TV that is the size of a fist.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate when games are pretty.
I do too. I'm not saying I don't appreciate pretty games. And
I had plenty of fun in my own way watching the interesting face animations of like Mass Effect Andromeda.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And again, that's one thing. I really feel like the issue comes when like memeing and disliking comes at the expense of individual people versus just having fun at the general game's expense. But that's just my own distinction.
Well, it's one thing to like, put a funny Mass Effect Andromeda face up on your Twitter and be like, LOL. Like, this is funny. It's another thing to put it up and be like, whoever made this is garbage. Like, you need to fix it. You have to fix it now. Fix it, fix it, fix it, you garbage human.
Especially when it's something on the scale of Mass Effect Andromeda. It's like, it's not like they don't know.
Yeah.
They're not stupid. Like, it went this way because something bad happened in the development process, and this is just how it had to be. Right? It's not... in cases like that, it's almost never, like, the developer's fault. It's probably more corporate type issues. But anyway, like, I do appreciate when games are pretty, right? Like, I've been playing Death Stranding, and it's very pretty. It's very pretty. And I think that the prettiness probably adds to the experience, right? Because you're looking at these environments for a long time.
Well, that's all you're doing in Death Stranding, right? But yes.
I don't think I could play Death Stranding on my Switch, like, in portable mode. Like, that would very much change the experience in a lot of ways. But that's not really because, like, I have a normal size TV. But again, like, if it's not, like, a horrible frame rate problems, which some people may define as, like, it's not a steady 60, but for me, it's like, it looks like a slideshow is the only time that it's really a problem. I don't really think about that kind of stuff, right? Like, it's always impressive when it looks really good, right? But it's not something that's necessarily a problem for me if it doesn't.
Yeah, it's like as long as it looks adequate, it's not gonna bother me.
And like The Witcher on the Switch, like who exactly expected that to look as good?
Oh, but that wasn't even what I was talking about. I was talking way back when it came out, in 2015. There was a whole thing about it looked a lot better in the trailers than it did in actual gameplay, and like. The guy, the one of their visual effects artists from CD Projekt was basically talked about, how it's really unfair to compare the trailers and the gameplay demos, right? The trailers, like, you put the camera in the right place and the light is perfect and it looks beautiful and it's never going to look that way when you're playing a game.
Right. And I don't know how it is specifically at CD Projekt Red, but also, like, marketing and development, depending on how big your company is, might have pretty much nothing to do with each other, right? Like, marketing is thinking of the best way to sell it that isn't necessarily reflective of the actual experience. And that would be a whole other topic about the ethics of marketing or whatever. But I feel like if you're at all an informed consumer, you have to be somewhat aware of that, right?
But the problem is that people aren't, right? Getting back to that same idea you raised, that people don't have any idea how games are made, which, like, to be fair, I don't really have any idea how games are made, really.
I mean, just the basic thing that I feel like any person who plays games should know is that it's hard to make games.
Sure.
Like, if you can understand that, I feel like it immediately puts a lot of things into perspective, right? Which doesn't feel that hard to understand.
So many people don't think art is hard, though, Emma. Like, you've been steeped in a people who get art world.
But this is art and technology, right? People think computers are hard, don't they?
I guess. But I just feel like, and this is where I do think some of the outrage culture has roots in something that's real. That in gaming, right? And I was reading a great article from like 5, 6, 7 years ago or something on Kotaku about this from Kirk Hamilton, where he was talking about like pre-order culture, right? Mm-hmm. Where everyone wants you to pre-order this game sight unseen or sight based on a trailer that is, you know, definitely, like, in some cases kind of misleading, right? And there definitely have been cases. It's not the majority of the time. It's not even, like, it's an underwhelming majority of the time. But there have been cases with big games where they've been sort of intentionally deceptively marketed, right? Mm-hmm. And that the trailers that have been released have been, you know, really misleading. And so because of that, I think that there's a real lack of trust between some groups of capital G gamers and developers, that they think that if the game isn't exactly what they expect that it is, that they've been tricked on purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, I really do feel like a lot of it comes from they think that there's something malicious there. And somehow they think that it's like personally targeted at them. Or they're interpreting it that way. Right? It's not just malicious to everyone. It's like they did this to me. And that's where sort of the rage and everything comes from. But I also think that there's this weird sense of entitlement too. Mm-hmm. Of like thinking, oh, I deserve this. Or like, I have better ideas about this than the actual creators do. So I should, you know, spam them on Twitter with my ideas or whatever. And it's just not reasonable. Like, sometimes as a consumer, you're going to make a bad choice, right? Like, you're going to go see a movie that you don't like. You're going to buy a game that doesn't click with you. And, like, that's just something you have to deal with. You're going to go to a restaurant that makes you sick, right? Like, you can go on Yelp and it has 5 stars and you eat an anchovy and you throw up, you know?
I do feel like in games, though, and this is part of what I think fuels this really over-the-top outrage and whatever, the push from the, like, sort of capitalist side to get people to pre-order the games, like, sight unseen, right? Not sight unseen, but, you know, to pre-order games based on marketing materials that even if you're an informed consumer, you know, are not quite real, right? Mm-hmm. Definitely makes this worse, right? The game companies, in some sense, are a little bit complicit in this by trying to get people to put money down for something that, like, isn't finished.
I mean, yes, capitalism has problems.
I know that. I know that. I'm just saying that games in particular, I think more than most movies, more than most, you know, books these days, anything like that, there's this real push of, like, buy it now, buy it now, buy it now. Like, here are these incentives to buy it now, right? Before there's anyone who can tell you what the game actually is, before even the development team might be able to tell you what the game actually is. So you see why some people feel like they've been intentionally misled, because in one very real sense, they kind of have been. Not usually by the people that they are going to go attack on Twitter, super unfortunately, but by this system that is particularly encouraging them to put blind faith into the company.
Sure.
I get it from that angle, is all I'm saying. I get why. Well, I don't really get it, but I get a little bit.
Shockingly, you can cancel pre-orders right up till it's shipped.
I know.
Right? And you don't spend any money. And most games, either they have a terrible review embargo, and you think that's a bad sign, and so you cancel it. Or they let reviews out, and you could read those reviews and be like, actually, I don't want to pre-order this.
Right.
But again, that has to do with being an informed consumer, and I know that people...
But these outraged gamers don't trust game journalism either, Emma.
That's true. And I don't know... I've never been able to fully understand, like, why people hate, like, Polygon and Kotaku so much. You know?
Well, because they don't want to think about games through any kind of light of identity culture.
Yeah. Even like silly things, like they published like a fluff piece and they're like, oh, it must be a slow news day. It's like, no, they just published a fluff piece that you don't have to click on. Or things I don't understand. I mean, like, I sort of do understand the issue with clickbait, but I also sort of don't. You know, like, I think my issue is that I take responsibility for my own choices, or at least I try to.
Right.
Whether that comes down to I clicked on an article that's dumb, or I bought a game that I didn't like. Like, at the end of the day, that was my decision to do so. But I feel like sometimes people do that and then don't want to admit that they made a mistake, so it's somebody else's fault. Right?
So how do you think this kind of idea changes when you're looking at a games as service model? Because I'm 100% on board that, like, yeah, you bought a $60 game, that's your choice. You made that decision, like, it's over. And granted, I know with games as service, you can, like, cancel your subscription, right? But do you feel like in that case where I'm continuing to pay the company that I should be listened to more, that my opinion should matter more?
I mean, the interesting thing is a lot of games of service, you still, like, there's no, subscription models are kind of down overall. And there's still MMOs that use subscription models. But a lot of other games have the one-time purchase and then either, like, season passes, DLC packs, or microtransactions.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so there's not really a huge market of games as service that are actually subscriptions. And my opinion with subscriptions is like, oh, you don't like it this month, then you don't pay it for that month. And then if they're doing something interesting again, you start paying again. Which is pretty easy, honestly. Like, you know, you could do that with, like, Netflix, for instance, of, like, oh, you pay for a month and watch the show you want to watch, and then you stop paying for Netflix for a while. But, you know, and I don't want to get into microtransactions because that is just an episode topic to itself. But honestly, no. I mean, I think that all creators should listen to fan responses to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
Like, if there's something that is not working and people are upset with it, then that's something that you bear in mind and put a patch out for or something, right? If there's a bug that people are reporting, you should be listening to that and patch that bug, right? But yeah, I mean, it's how, at the end of the day, it's still how you're spending your money, right? There's not really anything functionally different between buying something for $60 versus paying $10 a month for something, right? Like, you still chose to pay that money. And with a subscription, you can cancel anytime. So if you don't like it, you can just cancel it, right?
I was thinking more of the situation of, like, let's say I've been playing a World of Warcraft-esque game for 10 years, and all of a sudden they decide to change everything So those 10 years of work, like, disappear.
I mean, that's a weird... I don't...
Yeah, I know.
That's a very specific example that does have, I think, its own sort of, stuff with it.
Fair enough.
Although, like, there was the whole Fortnite thing of somebody, who cheated, who did a YouTube channel based on Fortnite, who was then lifetime banned from the game, and Ninja's reaction was saying, like, oh, if we're making money from it, we should be treated differently. This is not something that I agree with, personally. Even if a lifelong ban does seem a little harsh. But if that's their policy, that's their policy. Right?
That does feel a little silly, though. It's like, okay, so he was, like, playing around for a YouTube video. Like, he wasn't competing. I don't know.
But technically he was competing, right? Because he was playing with people.
I know, but...
I
can
don't know
shoot my partners on Fortnite, and no one's gonna ban me for that.
I very heartily disagreed with Ninja's take.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, for real. But also, I felt like, geez, a lifetime ban for him just like being a jerk in one game, like, big deal.
Yeah. But like, there's the stuff with like the Sonic movie, of how Sonic got a complete redesign, which, like, yeah, he looked real bad, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think it was really a marketing stunt. I think that there were corporate execs who had absolutely no conception of what they were doing and said, do this design. Because, like, they already had, like, merchandise put up, and that takes a while to put through. So in that case, at least, the movie did get delayed, which meant that animators and designers didn't have to super crunch to change things. But that's, like, not always the case, right? Like, sometimes things are bad and people complain about it. And is it really worth, like, is it so bad that it's worth, like, making people crunch, And so I'm sure some people would say yes, and I think that's where the problem is. Because we cannot accept, like, 7 out of 10 games, I think, is also the problem.
Well, do you think that's because of the hype machine around, like, very big games, or do you think that's because, I mean, easy answer is it's some of both, probably, but do you think that's more because of the hype machine, or do you think that's more because of, like, who gamers are as people, or just our culture in general?
I mean, I do think that there's, like, as a consumer, like, obviously you want to buy things that you enjoy and that you feel like are productive use of your time. And if you just buy something that's okay, you feel sort of, like, disappointed or offended. So I think it's a little bit the hype machine, right? Like, if you're really hyped for something and then it comes in and it's not as good as you want it to be. You saw that with, like, Kingdom Hearts 3.
Well, I was trying to think of how would I feel. It's like, whatever. You can feel how you want to feel about Kingdom Hearts 3. I think it was good. Not the best Kingdom Hearts game, but I think it was good.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? But, like, how would I have felt if Kingdom Hearts 3 had come out and just been, like, a disaster? Right?
I mean, I think it's perfectly fair to feel feelings of disappointment, but I'm not going to go on Twitter and tag Tetsuya Nomura and say, you piece of garbage human being.
That's where we're different. I might. Just want to talk.
Like, feeling disappointment about things you like not being as good as you want, and, like I said, legitimate criticism's fine. Like, I really enjoyed Kingdom Hearts 3. I thought it was a really solid game. I felt very fulfilled after beating it, but yeah, it did have some problems, right? That you could legitimately criticize about it. And this is where it becomes vice versa, in that all legitimate people get so sort of knee-jerky when they see criticism that because there's a big crowd that makes bad faith criticism or absurd criticism about things, that anything sort of legitimate gets sort of lost, right? Like, you see this with Death Stranding, in that this whole, like, there's a one document in the game that has some kind of backwards notions about, like, asexuality and the asexual spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, they're backwards, right? And that's totally fine to criticize while also acknowledging that there are cool parts of Death Stranding, right? But as soon as you bring up anything bad about Death Stranding, people think that Kojima needs an army to defend him, right? When, like, Hideo Kojima is, like, probably the one guy who, like, you could harass all you want and he would not care because he's Kojima, right? And that's not an invitation to go do it. I'm just saying, he has a certain cult of personality. In that, like, they're so used to people being like, oh, this is ridiculous or stupid or Kojima's so crazy that they feel sort of attacked when anything is criticized about the game.
Well, and it gets into that kind of that cancel culture idea, right? And I think this perversely, because these are the kind of people who would rail against cancel culture, I'm sure. But like the kind of gamers who can't stand, you know, whatever they would call left-wing gaming press websites, right?
Yeah.
No doubt it's a lot of the time it's because they can't read these articles that address, like, for example, I was seeing a lot of stuff about Cuphead, and like, you know, Cuphead's animation style is drawn from something that is kind of racist.
Yeah.
More than kind of racist.
The animation context of Cuphead is sort of inescapably couched in the racism that it originated from.
And you can discuss that without necessarily saying you shouldn't play Cuphead, it's a bad game, or it's a game that's doing harm.
Yeah.
That's super hard in our culture in general, of course, because that's not a nuance that's in vogue right now. It's something that I don't know. Like, here in games, I'm like, okay, sure, like, let's talk about it, but not necessarily cancel the game. On the other hand, in, like, other real-life issues, I don't feel like I often feel quite as generous. Like, oh man, this is my, like, theater nerd example, but God, this Michael Jackson musical that's coming to Broadway drives me nuts. Who is doing this? Who thinks this is a good idea? Its original title was Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Who thought of that? Who thought that was, like, the right way to market a musical about this guy who pretty clearly was not good?
Yeah.
And it's like, fine, like, I guess, like, whatever, if your own personal viewpoints allow you to listen to his music or to listen to R. Kelly's music or whatever, like, I guess I can see how you could do that. But also, like, I just don't feel that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a little bit different because it is sort of couched in real life. I feel the same in terms of looking at any games that sort of make me feel this way. The whole thing with Call of Duty and how they changed basically an American war crime into a Russian war crime. Like a real world American war crime into something the Russians did in the game. Like, makes me furious. Like, that's awful. Like, I know that whatever, the Call of Duty games are very jingoistic in a lot of ways, or at least patriotic. But, like, it's one thing to, you know, believe in American values at the end of the day, but it's another thing to actually rewrite history to say that we didn't do something that we did, right? Like, because it's very like, it's a fictional country, but it's very clearly based on a real situation. Yeah. And then I think it was the Modern Warfare guy who came out and said, I don't want politics in my game. Like, my dude, you have politics in your game. Like, very strong politics. And that's the other thing, is that, like, everybody is so knee-jerky about politics in games. And it's like, what does that even mean? You just don't want politics that you disagree with in the game, or politics that are noticeable in the game? Like, That's
Yeah.
so...
Well, you don't want somebody to talk about your game as political.
Right, yeah. That's true, too. But I think at the end of the day, it does come down to, like, on the positive side, it's very hard for people to accept that things they love have issues. Right? And on the negative side, it's very hard for people to accept that things that they feel personally, like, offended by, no matter how trivial, are things that people wouldn't mind or even like. Right?
But what do you do with that, right? Like, what I struggle with is, what do you do with a game? Here's my hypothetical game. It's a good game. It's a fun game. It does good things with mechanics, like the story's engaging, whatever. But it's got a character that deals in some outdated stereotypes about its race, gender identity, sexuality, take your pick, right? What do I do with that?
I mean, if it's, you know, A, you don't buy it because that's something that's personally important to you.
Okay.
You know, that's one choice you can make. B, I mean, I think it's just important looking at any kind of fiction that you're not just passively consuming it.
Sure.
Right? Like, on some level, you are thinking about it. Right? So, can you look at this piece of media and be like, overall, I like this. I like a lot of stuff about this. And still be able to say, but there's this that I recognize may be a deal breaker for some people. Going back into anime land, there's a manga called The Promised Neverland. That the first arc, it's very good. It's, you know, it's a manga that runs in the Big Boys magazine that has a female protagonist, which is very new and different in a lot of ways, unfortunately. And, you know, it has a lot of good things with her and a lot of good things with the other characters. But in the first arc, there's a character who is very much drawn as sort of a black stereotype. In terms of, like very specifically, like, artwork from, like, the sort of mammy type stuff. I don't remember how to pronounce it. But, just sort of racist looking in her depiction and the way that she is drawn. So, like, I think it's okay to still read that as long as you are aware of also what it's portraying. Right? Like, one of the things that got me started on being more interested in games in general and wanting to do the playlist series was, like, this is, like, a weird example to bring up, but, like, Danganronpa V3, the ultimate message of Danganronpa V3 is that fiction matters and you should think about it, right? Like, you should think about what it's saying to you and carry that with you, right? So no matter what you're watching, and I know this is exhausting, right? Like, that's an exhausting thing to propose, that everything you consume you're trying to be aware of on some level. But at the end of the day, I think that's a responsibility of a consumer and, you know, a person who reads or plays or watches stories.
I just wish that there was more space for people to talk about those things that they notice and that they pay attention to in a way that wasn't yelling.
That's the truth, right?
So I have one more kind of thought to add. And I don't know if this is a question or if it's just a sad comment. But do you feel like it's been interesting for me over the past couple of weeks to watch my Twitter be taken over basically by people who are angry that their favorite Pokemans doesn't get to do another different silly little dance on their Switch screen. Well, at the same time, you know, there's some major investigations going on in Congress as to whether the leader of the free world, like, broke the law.
Yeah.
Right? And all of the anger and outrage these people are able to feel about their cartoon, like, duck thing, psychic duck, versus how little I am able to feel about these impeachment hearings. And how empowered I would feel, like, to yell at Nomura on Twitter about Kingdom Hearts if I wanted to, versus how little impact I feel like tweeting at my representatives might have.
Yeah. I mean, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there, in that these are much smaller issues that we feel like we can have some control over. And when it comes to the president, like, for me, it's like, I've known he's broken the law since before he was elected. So it feels a little bit tiring to, like, watch them go through this when it feels so obvious to me that he has broken the law in major and minor ways over the course of before he was president, even. So that's why it's...
Like, that's part of it for me as well. It's just, like, the outrage fatigue, right? There's so many horrifying things that the government has done over the past 3 years that it's hard to care too much. It's like, okay, what? They held up some foreign aid for a little bit? Like, okay.
It might even... this would require much further research. This is just a brain idea of my part.
As opposed to what kind of idea, but okay.
A hard idea, obviously. Thank you, Nomura. But there's something about when things are so out of control in the greater world, there's something comforting about being really into a game or being really into a movie series, and knowing things about that and feeling in control about that. But because then we focus so hard on these things as a way to escape sort of the uncertainty of our real lives, it sort of becomes part of our identity in a way that's not healthy, right? Like, it's one thing to take good messages from fiction that we love or to enjoy things, but it's another thing to base our entire existence around Pokemon or Kingdom Hearts or whatever. That is then when that series that we have come to identify with ourselves to some extent does something bad, we get really mad at it, right? Because it's something that we latched onto when we were feeling uncertain about everything else, and therefore become something precious to us, become like a part of our daily existence. And then when that part of our daily existence then becomes uncertain, we get mad at it for, like, tricking us into caring about it, right? And then lash out in that sort of way. Because I know that I have, like, latched on to easier things when I'm feeling overwhelmed by life. Never to the extent that I think some people have on the internet. I don't think I've ever latched onto something as intensely as the people complaining about Dexit have. But I can sort of see the rationale in that, at least, or at least why someone would be upset. Even if I think that the response to that being upset is not the healthiest in the world. Don't send death threats to people.
There's one thing you take away from the 150 or so episodes of Talk This at this point. That should be the takeaway.
Yeah. I'm sure there's some situation somewhere in which a death threat may or may not be warranted, but it's definitely not.
Are you a phantom thief? In which case,
no,
you're not really threatening death, but you can threaten to take their heart. That's allowed.
Yes, that's fair. You can threaten, every bad person that you're gonna take their heart metaphorically. Just make sure you tag on the metaphorically on there. And maybe change the phrasing so they don't just think that you're gonna make them fall in love with you. It's a workshop. It's a work in progress.
This terrible mashup of a game that doesn't exist that I've tacked onto this episode just so we could have a bad mashup.
As always.
I dread the kind of comments that our mashups would get from people.
Oh God. They'd, as long as they weren't death threats, they'd be warranted in a lot of cases.
You're like, yeah, you're right. It does sound like two people just like threw darts at a wall.
It's definitely not what really happened. But anyway, that's the end of our surface level talking about this way too big topic.
Maybe we'll bring it back again for another episode.
Now, yeah, love it.
Don't know if I can stomach thinking about it.
Fun, happy times. Next week we're talking about
2 games.
Yeah, Madelyn, tell them about our social media while I remember what games we're talking about. So
if you liked what you heard today, or you've really hated what you heard today and you want to tell us how bad we are, you should find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talk This Podcast, and we're on YouTube at Talk This Sisters. So hit us up there. Give us your nuanced thoughts about what was good about this podcast and what was bad about this podcast. If you say that what was bad was me making my joke about cancel culture at the top, then you too are canceled. In fact, I'll just go ahead and respond for myself right now. But hey, if hitting us up on social media isn't enough for you, you should find us on our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read the blog, where I do in fact run a series where my boyfriend gets too attached to the Kingdom Hearts series, often to the point of tears. So you should check that out, as well as a series where Emma and I talk all sorts of nuanced thoughts about the very unnuanced shows now Coffee Prince and My Hero Academia. That's probably not fair. I've only watched a single episode of Coffee Prince, and My Hero Academia has some nuance. But we watch them for the broad strokes, and then we say hopefully good things about them. So trying to advance criticism one blog post with emojis at a time.
The true way.
But more than anything else, if you like the show, you should subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Pandora Podcasts, on the app and on your computer. Anywhere that you can find a podcast. Did I say Spotify? I feel like I've been forgetting to say Spotify lately. But we're also on Spotify, if that's your jam. So listen to the show. Leave us a review where you tell us the things that you think are good and the things that you think are bad. And you tell us you think the podcast is a 7 out of 10 just to prove that 7 out of 10s are just fine. That's my spiel.
Next time we're talking about Steins Gate and Control. I remember we're on a sci-fi kick now. Only sci-fi games.
This is not a sci-fi podcast.
So until then, I hope that